Good morning to my church family. We continue in our series on the Gospel of Mark. If you want to grab your Bibles, we'll be in Mark 11 today. I want to kind of give you a little history here. We are coming to the close of Jesus' earthly life. This is the last week of his life, and Kevin talked about the triumphal entry, which is probably on Sunday. Today we're going to be in Jerusalem on Monday, and then by the end of the week he'll be on the cross. If you can imagine that context of his teaching and the intensity of his teaching, we'll kind of look at that. I'm always amazed at this crowd that was welcoming him into Jerusalem, and where were they when he was hanging on the cross? How fickle the crowd is. When we don't give the crowd what they want, how quickly they can turn. Today we're going to be in Mark 11. We're going to start in verse 12, talking about the fig tree. We're also going to talk about the cleansing of the temple. Let's start in verse 12 and we'll go down through verse 23. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And the disciples heard him say this. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them by saying this, "Is it not written, my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it into a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when the evening came, they went out of the city. And as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree had withered away to its roots. And Peter remembered and said, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered." And Jesus answered, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes what he says, it will come to pass, and it will be done for him." I don't know about you, but I've always thought this passage was kind of disjointed. We go from the parable or the teaching about the fig tree to the cleansing of the temple, and then we go back to the fig tree thing again. I've always thought that it was kind of crazy how that works. I want to start today on the cleansing of the temple. It's kind of a famous passage. We often use this story to justify our own anger. And I would caution you against that about righteous anger. Very seldom of us have that. Very few of us have that. But the other Gospels tell us that Jesus goes to the temple kind of as he enters into Jerusalem. But Mark makes a distinction that he had gone back to Bethany. He'd gone to the temple on Sunday, looked around, goes back to Bethany to probably Mary and Martha's house, and he comes back in on Monday and goes to the temple. And I think that's important because this is not a knee-jerk reaction that Jesus walked into the temple and just started going crazy. He had seen what was going on in the temple on Sunday. He went away, he thought about it, and went back in and cleansed the temple. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. Jesus did get upset about this, and most often he gets upset about people who claim to have a relationship with God, but they've let it become polluted. And that's what the temple had become. It was a den of robbers. The Matthew account tells us that after the cleansing of the temple and the cursing of the fig tree, he goes into this long sermon against the Pharisees and the scribes about their hypocrisy. That's all in that context. There's a unique technique, a literary technique that's used in Eastern writing and sometimes in our writing called framing, where you try to get the meaning of the passage. You look what's ahead of it and what's after it. And if you look at that, there's probably a connection between the cleansing of the temple and the fig tree, and then the fig tree that comes after that. It's called framing. So let's talk about the fig tree just a little bit, and then we'll talk about the temple cleansing again. What's the deal with the fig tree? Some of you may have fig trees. My neighbor growing up had a fig tree, and we used to enjoy eating those, but the time for figs is late in the summer. And this is Passover time, so we're probably in the early spring. And Mark's the only one of the writers that says the fruit, this was out of season. There should not have been figs on that tree. And Mark brings that up. So how does this teaching about the fig tree, and then how does it relate to this idea about prayer and asking and receiving? This all seems kind of crazy to me. Often Jesus spoke in parables. I think he's living out a parable here. He's showing, by using this fig tree as a teaching object, he's actually living out a parable with them to teach them a spiritual truth. Over in Jeremiah 8, it says, I will take away their harvest, says the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine. There will be no figs on the tree, and their leaves will wither. What I have given to them will be taken away. If you go to the minor prophets, often the minor prophets correlate or use the example of fig trees and vines to represent the spiritual condition of Israel. And that's what's happening here. This fig tree without fruit is indicative of the spiritual life, the relationship that Israel is having with God. All leaves and no fruit. It was not yet time for the figs, is what Mark tells us. You know, figs sometimes have two crops. There's the crop that comes at the end of the summer, the August and July. But there's a thing called the briber crop, which early in the spring, you can go back and look at the older mature leaves or the older mature branches on the fig tree, and there will be some fruit that's on the old branches from last season. And a lot of the writers think that that's what Jesus was looking for here. There's this briber crop. It's out of season, but there should be fruit particularly on the older branches, on the more mature branches. It's becoming obvious to me as I study this that Jesus is talking about the spiritual condition of Israel, particularly about those who are supposed to be mature in their faith, and that they should have some fruit on their branches even at this time of year. In Texas, we have a saying called all hat, no cattle. I used that one time when I was out of state and I had to explain it to somebody. They had no idea what that means. You know what all hat, no cattle means, right? You're just all show. There's no substance behind it. There's nothing real behind it. And that's what Jesus is talking about, this fig tree. There's all leaves and no fruit. And I want you to take that idea back to the temple where Jesus is coming in and cleansing the temple. More than likely, this all took place in the court of the Gentiles. And it was an area in the temple where the Gentiles could gather. Even though they didn't have this relationship with God, they could go there and learn and study and maybe become a proselyted Gentile. The temple had ceased to produce the fruit that it was supposed to be producing. Israel had ceased to produce the fruit that it was supposed to be producing. And these officials had taken something probably very beneficial in the court of the Gentiles and polluted it. They were doing money exchanging. You had to have a certain coin to make an offering, and they were charging excess fees to get that particular coin. They were charging a fee for the poor people just to have a pigeon to make a sacrifice, and they were just abusing that. It had become a place of commerce, and that really upset Jesus. It was corrupt, it was polluted, and that's where we find things. I found this quote. It says, "These practices among the merchants reveal an important truth. In doing what is practical, people can actually profane the holy." In doing what is practical, people can actually profane the holy. A person can bring sacred matters down to ordinary levels by being practical. I got to thinking about this. This was probably a good idea at some point to have pigeons for sale in the temple and maybe some kind of exchange of coins. They probably had a men's business meeting and somebody said, this is a good idea. But even things that are practical, even things that start off good, can end up in bad intentions if we allow them to drift and we don't always ask the question, is this bearing fruit for the kingdom? I think things had drifted here. Things had gotten worse. And this all happens in the court of the Gentiles, where they should be seeing what God wants them to see, and they're seeing a corrupt and polluted Israel. Peter, over in 1 Peter, the 2nd chapter, says that we are a chosen people, a royal priesthood. The priest was supposed to represent what God is to man, to show what God's nature is. That was one of the jobs of the priest. And so when you have this in the court of the Gentiles, they should be bearing fruit by showing the Gentiles the very best of God, and they were showing the Gentiles the very worst of mankind in this place. The Jews should have been showing God to these people, and they did not. A.W. Tozer is a good writer, and I benefit from him. He said this, he says, "Many, perhaps most of the activities engaged in by the average church do not contribute in any way to the accomplishment of the true work of Christ on earth." Whoa. That sounds harsh, and I'm not sure I agree with it fully, but I do agree with this. We need to ask that question. It may be too harsh, but we always have to ask the question, is what we're doing bearing fruit for the kingdom, or has it drifted into something we never intended it to? I think the natural progression often is that without spiritual direction and spiritual thought, we tend to drift into more areas of the leaves and bearing less fruit. It's a slow drift. That's why things like the Reformation movement needed to come along. That's why things like the Restoration movement comes along. And I don't think we're ever through with that. I think we always have to ask those questions. Is what we're doing leaves or fruit? I see some movements today in the church that give me great encouragement, because it's maybe another restoration movement, and I love that, because we always have to ask, is what we're doing bearing fruit? So I got thinking about what's leaves and what's fruit in our lives. Leaves could be our building, it could be our programs, it could be our parents, it could be church membership, it could be our fellowship and our assemblies and our get-togethers. Those could all be leaves. What is fruit? Well, serving, forgiving, enduring, loving, doing second mile stuff, being disciple, making business. But the leaves should lead to fruit. If the leaves are not leading to fruit, we need to stop and take a look at it and reevaluate. The temple had become more show than substance. It had developed to a place where it was never intended to be. And the practices and the rituals did nothing. There was no aspect of the heart, no aspect of relationship with God. There was nothing toward the poor. There was nothing toward the broken. There was nothing toward the seeker. And Jesus was very upset about that. These merchants in the temple were all about the trees with no fruit. So, let's finish up now. There's this thing where Jesus goes into a discussion about prayer. Let's go back to the text in let's go to verse 20. They passed in the morning, and they saw the fig tree withered away. And Peter remembered and said, "Look, Rabbi, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." And Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will come to pass for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anybody else, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you of your trespasses." So it's almost like Jesus is answering a question here that's not asked. He takes this back to prayer. How do we go from this fig tree discussion to this idea about faith and prayer? Jesus' main point in all this section is that we have a purpose. And Israel had a purpose. An intended purpose was that they show the rest of the world what God is like. Israel, at least the leadership of Israel, the Sadducees, the priests, the Pharisees, seemed to have missed that mark. They were all hat and no cattle, and they had drifted out of God's intended plan and purpose. And Jesus is challenging us as disciples to be careful about being about leaves and not about fruit. Somebody said this: God is looking for spiritual fruit, not religious nuts. I kind of like that. Could it be that being in alignment with God's plan and purpose, being more concerned about fruit than about leaves, being a disciple that is more about making disciples, directly affects our prayer life? I'm going to close with a reading out of John 15, and you know this well. "I am the vine, and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch that withers. The branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so prove to be my disciples." John takes this idea about bearing fruit and links it with prayer as well. Could it be that as I am more about fruit than just about leaves, that my thoughts as a disciple line up with God's thoughts more and more, and so what I ask of God is more in line with his will, and so there's this beautiful relationship here. But if I'm not abiding, if I'm not where I need to be in my spiritual walk, if I'm not about fruit, I'm more about showing about leaves, then what I ask in my prayer life may be out of kilter with what God. I'm not saying we don't always go to God and pray. We don't have to be perfect to pray, but I think it's wonderful when our prayer life, my wishes, my will, lines up with God's will. And I think that's really what he's saying in this time. I want to close with a little passage or a little quote that I found. "Ships are safe in the harbor, but that's not what they're designed for. We are designed as disciples to bear fruit. If we're not bearing fruit, we are out of kilter with what God's will is, and that makes him upset. We need to be more about fruit and less about leaves. We need to show the world what Jesus is about, show the world what God's about, and that's how we bear fruit for him. God bless you in your study today.